Psalm of Life by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, 1839. What the heart of the young man said to the psalmist. Tell me not in mournful numbers, life is but an empty dream, for the soul is dead that slumbers, and things are not what they seem. Life is real, life is earnest, and the grave is not its goal. Dust thou art, to dust returnest, was not spoken of the soul. Not enjoyment, and not sorrow, is our destined end or way, but to act, that each tomorrow find us further than today. Art is long and time is fleeting, and our hearts, though stout and brave, still, like muffled drums, are beating funeral marches to the grave. In the world's broad field of battle, in the bivouac of life, be not like dumb driven cattle, be a hero in the strife. Trust no future, however pleasant. Let the dead past bury its dead. Act in the living present, heart within and God o'erhead. Lives of great men all remind us we can make our lives sublime, and departing leave behind us footsteps on the sands of time. Footsteps that perhaps another, sailing o'er life's solemn main, a forlorn and shipwrecked brother, seeing, shall take heart again. Let us then be up and doing, with a heart for any fate, still achieving, still pursuing, learn to labor and to wait. In 1837, a young American professor set out on a European vacation with his family. Born and raised in New England, he had fallen in love with Europe a decade before, having traveled extensively in Spain, Italy, and Germany. Now he was back, this time with his new wife, and he was ready to explore Scandinavia. But all did not go as planned. His wife miscarried. There were complications. As if in an omen, he watched a church burn to the ground. Then his wife died. Crushed, aimless, he wandered through Germany, looking for anyone and anything to give him a purpose. He attached himself to another family from New England who was holidaying in Germany. He had hopes that his friendship with their daughter, Frances, would perhaps lead to a second chance at love. But when they returned to America, Frances spurned his advances. This is the sad story of Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, who in the 1830s did not plan on becoming the most famous American poet in the world. Longfellow loved literature and had helped to make his mark on American culture as a professor and writer of tales. But the sting of tragedies and disappointments he endured drove him to poetry, and he wrote A Psalm of Life on a July evening in 1838, seeing that his first love was gone forever, and his glimmering second chance was not to be. He later wrote that the poem was, quote, a voice from my inmost heart when I was rallying from depression, unquote. A single lyric poem did not seem like enough, and so Longfellow also wrote a thinly veiled autobiographical novel called Hyperion about his unlucky love life. Hyperion was not a critical success, but A Psalm of Life became an international sensation. Nathaniel Hawthorne said, "Nothing like it has been written in our world." This might have been an exaggeration. It was true that American poetry had been limping along since the Revolutionary era. The great poets of that generation, Phillis Wheatley, Philip Freneau, Joel Barlow, they were all dead and gone. William Cullen Bryant, who briefly mentored Longfellow, had written popular and impressive poems in the 18-teens, but history was moving on, and no great American poet had recently emerged. A Psalm of Life was thus a trumpet call which announced that a new poet had arrived. And arrive Longfellow did, For the next 4 decades, he published over a dozen collections of poems that made him a household name in both America and Europe. By the time Longfellow died, his birthday was celebrated as a national holiday. And about Frances. In 1843, she let Longfellow know that maybe she had been too harsh on him. They were soon married. A Psalm of Life is a very different poem formally from the great accomplishments of Bradstreet, Wheatley, and others. First and most fundamentally, it relies on a metrical structure that is the inverse of the iambic patterns that dominate the verse of Bradstreet and Wheatley. Longfellow's chosen metrical foot is the trochee, a 2-syllable stressed-unstressed pattern. Thus, instead of stresses on the even syllables, as in iambic meter, Longfellow's stresses are on the odd syllables. This creates a driving, more obviously drumbeat rhythm, one that Longfellow would return to many times, most famously and massively in the Song of Hiawatha, which consists of thousands of lines of trochaic tetrameter. Tetrameter lines also predominate in A Song of Life, but with a twist. A standard line of trochaic tetrameter is 8 syllables long, beginning with a stressed syllable and ending with an unstressed syllable. Da-da, 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 da-da. But Longfellow clips the final unstressed syllable off of his even-numbered lines in the Psalm of Life, creating an 8-7-8-7 syllable structure in each of the 9 stanzas. In doing this, Longfellow mitigates an inherent problem with the lines of trochaic meter. Though trochaic lines begin strong, their final unstressed syllable can leave the end of a line seeming weak or unresolved. By ending each stanza on the 7th stressed syllable, this allows Longfellow to keep the trochaic rhythm and still end each stanza on a strong stressed syllable. This choice to end lines 2 and 4 of each stanza on a stressed syllable also allows him more variety in his rhyming. The rhyme scheme of each stanza is A, B, A, B. Joined to the 8-7-8-7 syllable structure of each line, this means that Longfellow in each stanza gets to rhyme 2 words that end in unstressed syllables, for example, numbers and slumbers, and 2 words that end in stressed syllables, dream, seem. If Longfellow had ended every line on a stressed syllable, we would perhaps have grown tired of the single-syllable words, usually short, simple nouns and verbs like fate or wait, that naturally predominate at the end of iambic lines. But in structuring his stanza such that 2 lines will always end with unstressed syllables, Longfellow forces himself to find more various types of words, like earnest and returnest, as his end rhymes. He even gives us rhyming phrases like remind us and behind us. Despite these intentional and not uncomplicated formal choices, the poem as a whole has always struck readers as clear, direct, almost effortlessly earnest. These qualities were highly prized by Longfellow's contemporaries as proof of the poet's manly honesty. It was only in the generations after Longfellow's death that Psalm of Life began to be viewed as distastefully sentimental. But let's push back the accumulated critical overgrowth and look at the major images and conceits of the poem, which remains, I would argue, one of the most powerful poems of the American 19th century. The subtitle of the poem lets us know that it is spoken by one character, the young man, to another character, the psalmist. And it is spoken from the heart of that young man. Right away, we know that the poem should be read with its source in mind, a young man's heart. Reading the opening lines with this in mind reveals this poem to be a sort of manifesto of proper poetic subjects, addressed to a poet himself from a young male audience. Tell me not, O poet, in mournful numbers, life is but an empty dream. In other words, don't write me poetry that tells me to despair. Instead, write a poetry of hope, addressed to the soul, which is not bound for the grave or the dust. Longfellow is here espousing, through his eager young man, a supernaturalist position. We are not all material, and our souls are eternal. What's more, we are called to act instead of experiencing mere desire or emotion, whether negative, sorrow, or positive, enjoyment. This is a sort of basic Aristotelian or even Stoic account of life. We must strive to live a life of noble action, not despair or hedonism. We'll talk about this more later. Longfellow next adapts an old aphorism of Hippocrates: "Art is long and time is fleeting." Though Hippocrates' original quote is something more like, "Life is short and art takes a long time to make." But Longfellow very freely borrowed from the classics and the ancients. He then moves back to the subjects of hearts, which he says are beating out a funeral music. We might ask whether the threat of death, of life's end, overcomes the hopeful heart of the opening stanza, or whether the hopeful heart can overcome the muffled drums that beat toward the grave. Longfellow returns us in the middle of the poem to this really important, what we might even call Stoic subject, which is action. It is neither sorrow nor enjoyment that our life should aim at, but rather to act that each tomorrow find us further than today. And then he sort of dials up the drama and moves from action to heroic action. He says we shouldn't live the life of cattle, which would be a life of sort of bodily pleasures alone, but instead we are to live the life of a hero, be a hero in the strife. We return then to action, act in the living present, heart within and God overhead. It's interesting here that action, which we might associate with the will or the mind, is something that the heart is doing. This is an action of the heart, not just of the mind or of the will. And I think it's very interesting that Longfellow is picking up on this theme, which does go all the way back to Aristotle and further, that the core of man, the heart of man, the spirit of man, is something that drives human action. The final three stanzas of A Psalm of Life contain lines that have become indelible to many generations of Americans. Our own potentially accepted, but if you talk to someone who grew up, say, in the mid-20th century or earlier, they will know these lines, probably by heart. Following on the concept of the hero introduced in the previous paragraph, Longfellow bids us to look to and learn from the lives of great men. Longfellow's list of great men may have looked a little different than the list we might make. Longfellow's heroes, we learn from his journals, from his letters, and from other poems, were people like Washington Irving, Jean-Paul Richter, Goethe, Dante, even older figures like St. Olaf or St. John Chrysostom. Longfellow saw in these men of great achievement an achievement that was not easily won, but an achievement that was accomplished only through great struggle. Dante is perhaps the clearest image of this achievement through struggle. He was an exiled wanderer, a poet who mourned the death of his true love, who skirted hell and despair with his steps, but was hopeful enough to keep his eyes ultimately fixed on paradise. And out of that difficult life came the great cathedral of a poem that is the Divine Comedy. In 1838, when the Psalm of Life was being written, Longfellow could sympathize quite strongly with Dante, especially in terms of lost love. Looking at Longfellow's 1839 collection, Voices of the Night, further confirms this, as it contains several translations from the Divine Comedy focusing on the figure of Beatrice, Dante's lost love, but also Dante's hope of heaven. Voices of the Night would also be the first collection of poems that Dante published, which included and featured, I think most prominently, A Psalm of Life. A whole study should be written on Longfellow's phrase, "footsteps on the sands of time." It is important to note that Longfellow did not write footprints in the sands of time, as is often misquoted. By the 1850s, publishers did begin reprinting the poem with the variation of footprints instead of footsteps. And it's worth a research project, which I have not yet done, why printers begin to include that variation. But when Longfellow originally wrote it, it wasn't footprints on the sands of time, let alone footprints in the sands of time. It was footsteps on the sands of time. Whether or not Longfellow's poem actually inspired the 20th century kitsch story Footprints in the Sand, the two works are connected in the American consciousness, and like I said, this deserves its own research project. For our purposes, though, we can at least keep in mind that the footsteps Longfellow calls us to are the example of virtuous actions left by the great men of the past. It is these actions that provide the alternative to the cycle of enjoyment and sorrow that the young man of the epigraph is so prone to. Right action is not the path to enjoyment. It is the path beyond the need for a life of enjoyment. Or it might be more right to say that the young man who has faced true tragedy, as Longfellow had, as Dante had, such a young man has been made aware that a certain kind of enjoyment is and will never be available to them again. Thus, the only options are despair or action. Longfellow's psalm understands that despair is tempting, that life is but an empty dream is a typical mode of the poet. But Longfellow, in his final stanza, gives us an ultimate counter-statement to the empty dream. Let us then be up and doing, with a heart for any fate, still achieving, still pursuing, learn to labor and to wait. Those who see a stoicism in this final stanza are in good company. Longfellow's advice firmly places moral responsibility on how we should approach and react to life. Epictetus, the Stoic philosopher of the ancient world, famously taught that humans have no control over anything but their reactions to circumstance. Longfellow's call for us to have a heart for any fate is in keeping with this teaching, and it's also in keeping with his focus from even the beginning of the poem on the heart. It is characteristic of Longfellow to leave us with a pensive and difficult word. He does not, we should note, end on a phrase like a hero in the strife, as a lesser poet might have, but rather leaves us with to labor and to wait. Neither the laboring nor the waiting are glamorous. Neither can be accomplished in a blaze of glory. In fact, it is tempting to see in these final two verbs a sort of poetics emerging. It is labor and patience that make the man, and it is also labor and patience that make the poet. Without labor and patience, the stanzas will not be symmetrical, nor the rhymes regular and crisp. Without labor and patience, a poem cannot pass from scribbles on a page to a well-penned fair copy, to a printer's draft, to the published page. And without labor and patience, the disappointed writer, loveless, not yet famous, with middle age approaching, without labor and patience, he cannot reach within himself, cannot lay down the lines of pining, cannot give America new words for its sorrow and its endurance. Nothing without labor.